Hello, ABS students. This lecture is going to be focused on speciation. So up until now, we've been talking about how change can occur within a species over time, and now we're going to discuss how you can actually get new species through evolutionary mechanisms. So the first thing to consider is what we call the biological definition of species. And so this means that it is a group of organisms that can reproduce with one another in nature and produce fertile or viable offspring. So that means that they can reproduce and so can their offspring. So the species is the most basic category in the system of taxonomy. And so it's basically the most specific, so think species specific, that you can get. So with our example over here, the domain is the highest. So um, if you've learned or memorized in your past how these are all classified, um, the species is at the very bottom. And then also when we look at more phylogenetic looking trees, the species are really the furthest on the outside. So the first step to speciation is isolation. So this is a way that one population becomes two populations. And the underlying importance here is that they can no longer reproduce together. So isolation is basically the lack of gene flow. So in the little picture here, we have these beetles. Something happens that these two beetles get isolated. So let's say this is a stream or something like that. Um, and then now they're in these two distinctive groups that can no longer flow back and forth between them. And so they're now only reproducing within their divided groups. There's a few different ways that you can get isolation, so it's not just a physical thing. So one can be temporal isolation. So I really liked this picture from the amoeba sisters because it talks about the release of pollen. So something could be changing in the environment that has two organisms that could normally have reproduced, like these two plants, but one of them, for some reason, is an off time of when it would produce pollen. Okay, so this can often be due to movement in space. So a group of, or part of the group of organisms moving to someplace different, a change of resources. So in one part of the population, the resources that they need for survival and reproduction are more abundant certain times of the year than others. But basically the underlying effect of this is that they no longer reproduce together. So we have a division of reproduction in a group that was once able to reproduce together. Another type is behavioral. And so when we talk about sexual selection, we'll talk a little bit more about mating behaviors. But this basically means that something's happening that certain parts of the population are no longer receptive to the behaviors of the other part of the population. And this can cause a decrease in mating. So birds will sing to attract mates. So for some reason, this female over here doesn't like the song of the male. And so if this happens with a lot of these birds, then we now have an isolated group that does no longer reproduce with the original group. And then the last one is probably the easiest to kind of wrap your head around, is the geographic isolation. So basically something happens, a new river forms, or in the large sense, when we talked about Earth history, the continents moving apart. So this means basically that a group that was once close together physically in proximity no longer is. So some of them are in a different area, and so they just physically cannot be close enough to reproduce together. So, but like any other type of isolation, all of these are going to cause a reduction in reproduction between the groups. So the second step is basically that everything else keeps happening. So we had in step one a reduction of gene flow. So something happened that this group was divided into two separate groups that no longer reproduce together. But these two groups are going to continue in their own isolated areas, going under the other evolutionary mechanisms. So mutation, natural selection, and genetic drift is going to continue happening in both groups. So you can see in the bug example up here, the group on the top had some genes, obviously, for some green bugs that were apparent once they split, and the bottom one did not. And so over time, let's say maybe there was more green leaves in this area, if they were geographically isolated, these bugs could blend in easier if they were green, so they survived to reproduce. Whereas in this other area, maybe the leaves were more brown, and so they could survive and reproduce better there. So over time, all of the other things that contribute to a trait are continuing to happen, but they are isolated from one another, and so you don't see flow between these two groups. And what happens eventually is that they will become different enough that even if they were to flow back and forth with each other, they would not be able to reproduce any longer. And so basically, this is an idea of continued change. So again, as we can see, these populations became isolated and then they continue to differentiate based on their own individual mutations and selective pressures and all that kind of good stuff. Okay, so there's a couple different explanations of how change can occur over time that results in different species. And so this would be basically after the isolation step, what happens then? So the two explanations are graduated and punctual. So on the right here, you can see sort of a graduated change um, where we see the butterflies are changing rather subtly over time, where you see these two arrows coming off. Or on the far right, you see that there's more discrete forks. So basically something happens that makes a dramatic change, and then there's basically a continued change along those lines. On the left, we can see the same thing happening with bird beaks. So you have gradual speciation. So there's some changes at the beginning that gradually cause the ability for more and more change to occur, and then depending on the circumstances will be selected for, versus on the bottom, you see what we would consider more punctuated, where there's a more dramatic change from the original to a new form. So which one of these actually happens? The answer is that it could be either or both. So depending on the underlying causes of the trait, so in terms of genetics, regulation, how it's inherited, the environment, it can happen either way. So it's not a case of is it graduated or punctuated. It's basically certain traits you can see develop very quickly because they develop in larger sections just through like cellular differentiation. And other ones, it would take a lot more genetic change to actually cause the trait to be different. So the answer is not really an answer. It's that both of these are possible. And so the last step is basically over time, like I said, new species can arise. So you can see these branch points here. The idea is that once this happens, that these species can no longer reproduce together. So if we have this original source here, like where this little yellow dot is here, that some sort of isolation has happened. And now we have, instead of this species, we have species A and species B. The idea is that they can no longer reproduce. And this is referring back to specifically the biological definition of species. Some examples of speciation that you can see or that we could see kind of in real time. One of the most famous examples is referring to the Galapagos finches. These finches are famous for a couple reasons. First of all, Darwin identified different characteristics and different species of them and categorized them very thoroughly, but also Peter and Rosemary Grant have been studying there for several decades and have watched new species form within their lifetimes, especially after dramatic weather events. So what you can look at is the different shapes of the beaks. So on the right here, you can kind of see that the different shapes allow these birds to eat different food sources. And depending on the weather, some of these food sources are more abundant than others. And so selective pressures can vary dramatically. And once these are on islands, so they are naturally isolated. So once the isolation occurs, these selective pressures can cause change very quickly. Another example here is you can see through time. So if you should recognize some of these eras here, we can see the lineage that led to what we know as the Asian and African elephants. So where these are stopped is basically where they went extinct. So these other elephants, but you can see that they all kind of branched back to this original organism back here. So as they went through different branching events, so again, isolation, and then other continued mechanisms, we got different versions. of things that are similar to the elephants, but the ones that are currently left today are only these two species, the Asian and the African elephant. There are actually exceptions to the biological definition of species. So one of the most obvious ones is uh, organisms that don't reproduce anyway in the same way that other ones do. So if they're asexual, they don't have to actually combine to reproduce. So you can see binary fission in amoeba, so they divide in order to reproduce. You can also see the hydra, so like the budding of these plants. So they're reproducing in different ways. Runners from plants. So I know strawberries do this, a lot of other plants do this. And then probably the most common example, at least that I see in my house, is the potato. So the potato can actually shoot off runners, so it can reproduce other potato plants without having to actually mix with any other organisms. So you can't really use reproductive isolation if they don't need to have other organisms near them to reproduce. Some other exceptions are hybrids. So hybrids are a little more rare in the animal kingdom, but we do see them. And it's interesting because they can either be less fit and completely unviable, meaning that they can't reproduce, like mules cannot make more mules, or they can be stronger than either individual parent species because it is going to increase genetic diversity and shuffling and actually tends to that all contributes to healthier immune systems sometimes. One of the ones that you might recognize, this very popular, very beautiful macaw, is actually the result of a cross from a scarlet and a blue and yellow. So those are two different other species. So it is a hybrid. A liger is another example. The ligers are much larger than the tigers and the lions that they come from. So they tend to be much bigger. So they kind of fit in that second category. Another thing, plants are another fairly obvious example of hybridization that we see all the time. So many of the plants that contribute to the foods that you eat are hybrids. And a lot of times they'll do this in order to have the most beneficial crop. So for example, with the tomatoes up here, they basically are crossing a heat tolerant species with a high flavor species. So it makes them easier to grow, but also delicious. And then down here we have like a grapefruit crossed with a tangerine, so you can do this with fruits. When you see flowers that have some interesting patterns, those are often hybrids because they're species that would normally have one distinct color or the other. And then I thought it was very interesting. This Animal Crossing, which lots of people are into, has some interesting hybridization of plants happening here. So it's a not necessarily realistic example, but one that you might recognize of how you can get hybrid plants. Okay, so to just recap with speciation, it's often much simpler than people tend to think when they first start out looking at evolution, but there's two basic fundamental steps. The first one is reduction in gene flow, so that's the isolation. And the second step is everything else keeps happening, just separately into the two isolated groups. And over time, they will get to a point that they're different enough if the situation is appropriate for it, that they can no longer reproduce. So that is all under the umbrella of biological species definition. However, there are some exceptions to that, including asexual reproducing organisms and hybrid organisms that we see very often. One of the things is a little hard to wrap your head around of why do we have this definition when there's so many exceptions. Just remember that nature does what it does, and we're imposing kind of our restrictions on it. So it makes sense for us to have this definition that works for the most part in how we understand the delineation between different organisms. But we have all these really interesting exceptions that are also biologically important to remember.